Stand at the corner of Division Street and Larrabee Street in Chicago today, and you are standing in one of the most expensive residential districts in the American Midwest. There is a Target store on the corner. There are glass condominiums, a shopping center, new apartment blocks with rooftop decks, and a 10-minute walk east puts you among the mansions of the Gold Coast. 35 years ago, standing on this exact corner, you would have been standing in the middle of Cabrini-Green, 70 acres of public housing towers that had become the most notorious address in America. 15,000 people lived here at the peak, 23 towers and a village of row houses. The country knew it from news footage of snipers and funerals, and Hollywood used its stairwells as the setting for a horror film. Almost all of it is gone now, knocked down between 1995 and 2011. What destroyed Cabrini-Green, the conventional account says, was the people inside it. But Cabrini-Green did not sit in a dying neighborhood, the way the famous failed projects did. It sat on some of the most valuable land in Chicago, 1 mile from the Magnificent Mile, and that single fact explains its fate better than anything that happened inside its walls. The land is why it was built where it was built. The land is why it was left to rot, and the land is why it is gone. To see how, you have to start with what was on that ground before, because this same 70 acres has been cleared of its poor twice. In the middle of the 19th century, the low ground along the north branch of the Chicago River filled up with the people who could afford nothing better. Swedes first, in a district they called Swedetown, then the Irish. A gasworks stood among the shanties, and its burning flares lit the underside of the smoke at night, so the neighborhood earned a name that stuck for a century: Little Hell. By the early 1900s, the Swedes and Irish had moved up and out, and Sicilian immigrants moved in. 20,000 Italians by 1920, and Little Hell became Little Sicily. It was crowded, poor, and violent in a way that made the newspapers. One intersection, Oak Street and Cleveland Avenue, saw so many extortion killings by the gangsters known as the Black Hand that Chicago called it Death Corner. The housing was wooden, cold, and owned by absentee landlords. When city inspectors surveyed it in the 1930s, they found blocks where most homes lacked private toilets. The verdict on the district was the same one every American city was reaching about its immigrant slums, and the new federal money of the New Deal offered a cure. Clear it and build clean, modern housing for working families. Little Sicily's residents scattered ahead of the bulldozers. Their neighborhood exists today only in photographs, a fact worth remembering when the towers come down at the end of this story, because the city that erased Cabrini-Green had erased the place before it too. The census takers and the settlement house workers who walked Little Sicily left a record of a neighborhood that was more than its murders. The parish church of St. Philip Benizi anchored the district, and its summer festivals filled the streets with processions, brass bands, and food stalls. Thousands of people shoulder to shoulder in the same blocks the newspapers only visited for bodies. Men worked the gasworks, the docks, and the factories along the river. Women took in sewing and boarders. Children were everywhere. The pattern matters because it repeats. For the next century, every community that lived on this ground would be described by outsiders entirely through its worst days, and every community that lived on this ground would remember itself through its ordinary ones. What replaced Little Hell in 1942 was, by every account, a success. The Frances Cabrini Rowhouses, 586 apartments in neat 2- and 3-story brick rows, named for an Italian nun who had worked among Chicago's immigrants, and who, 4 years after the houses opened, became the first American citizen to be canonized a saint. The row houses were built as wartime workers' housing, and they came with standards. The Chicago Housing Authority in those years was run by a woman named Elizabeth Wood, a former English teacher who ran public housing like a proud landlord. Tenants were screened, rents were collected, grounds were kept. Wood believed public housing should look like something a family aspired to, and for a while it did. There were waiting lists to get in. Veterans came home from the war to those row houses. The first tenants were mostly white, under a quota system that matched the project to the old neighborhood's makeup, with a minority of black families. And for its first decade, the little development on the site of Little Hell was the model everyone pointed to. It is the part of the story nobody remembers, and the physical proof of it still stands, which matters later. The towers came in 2 waves, and the reasons they came were the same reasons as in every American city. Chicago's black population was growing fast, hemmed by segregation into overcrowded districts, and the federal government was paying for high-rise public housing by the acre. In 1957 and 58, the Cabrini extension opened just north of the row houses, 1,925 apartments in red brick mid-rises and high-rises that residents came to call the Reds. In 1962 came the William Green homes, 1,096 more apartments in pale concrete towers of 15 and 16 stories, the Whites, named for a president of the American Federation of Labor. Together, the three developments held about 3,600 apartments, and at the peak, some 15,000 people. One of the largest concentrations of public housing in the country, and by the time the last tower opened, the population inside was almost entirely black. The white families had gone to bungalow belts and suburbs that were closed to their black neighbors by covenant, by redlining, and by violence. Whatever the intention, the effect was that the city had stacked its poorest black citizens 15 stories high on 70 acres beside its richest white neighborhood, and then, decade by decade, withdrew everything that had made the Rowhouses work. The people who grew up in those early years described a place later Chicago found impossible to imagine. Mothers who swept the shared walks each morning, flower beds in front of the rows, a waiting list that made a Cabrini address something a family announced with pride. The Rowhouses sat within walking distance of tens of thousands of jobs, the factories along the river, the warehouses, the enormous Montgomery Ward catalog complex on Chicago Avenue, where a clerk's wage could carry a household. Fathers walked to work, children walked to school. Rent came out of a paycheck, not a benefit check, because in those years, most Cabrini households were working households. None of this is nostalgia. It is documented in the Housing Authority's own records and in the memories of tenants who lived long enough to watch the country forget it was ever true. What broke it was not a mystery and not a curse. It was a sequence of decisions, and the first one had a name attached. The withdrawal had a starting date. In 1954, Elizabeth Wood was forced out of the Chicago Housing Authority. She had spent years fighting the city council over where public housing would be built and who could live in it, insisting that black tenants be housed in white neighborhoods. And the machine politicians who controlled the sites had had enough of her. After she was gone, the authority stopped fighting. Projects went where the aldermen wanted them, which meant stacked in black districts, and everything Wood had fought for, the screened tenancy, the collected rent, the landlord who showed up, began unraveling the moment she left. The income ceiling was next. Public housing had income limits written into the rule book. Succeed, get a raise, and you were required to leave. The steelworker and the postal clerk and the two-income family, the tenants who anchored the buildings, were skimmed off year after year, and the buildings filled with the poorest of the poor, because the rules allowed no one else to stay. Then the maintenance money went. As at every big city authority, it fell behind the building's needs. And at Cabrini, the gap showed early. Elevators built to serve 150 families each began failing in the 1960s and stayed failed for weeks. Light fixtures in the galleries and stairwells were smashed faster than they were replaced, then stopped being replaced. The open gallery corridors, boasted about in the brochures as sky sidewalks where children could play above the street, were caged with chain link fencing after objects and, eventually, people went over the railings. The fencing made every floor look like a cell block. The photographs of those caged galleries became the visual shorthand for everything Americans believed about public housing. And the land under those caged galleries, 1 mile from the Magnificent Mile, was already some of the most valuable, underdeveloped ground in the American Midwest. The city did not act on that. Not yet, but developers noticed. The jobs went first, as they went everywhere. The river corridor west of Cabrini had been lined with factories, tanneries and foundries and food plants, and the enormous Montgomery Ward catalog headquarters stood a short walk south on Chicago Avenue, a complex that had employed thousands of clerks and packers and drivers, the kind of work Cabrini tenants had been hired into for a generation. Through the 60s and 70s, the plants closed or moved. Montgomery Ward shrank toward its eventual death, and the unemployment rate inside Cabrini-Green climbed toward levels that no neighborhood absorbs intact. Into the vacuum came the gangs, the Cobra Stones, the Gangster Disciples, the Vice Lords, organizations that recruited boys the economy had no use for and armed them, and that turned individual towers into territory. By the late 1960s, the Reds and the Whites were divided into rival fiefdoms, and the open ground between the buildings, all that modernist green space, had become a no-man's land that residents crossed at a run. Daily life reorganized itself around the geometry of gunfire. Residents of those years described the adaptations with the flatness of people describing weather. Mattresses dragged onto the floor so children slept below the window line. Babies laid in bathtubs during shooting, because cast iron stops what drywall does not. Groceries timed to the morning hours before the corners filled in. Which stairwell you could use depended on which building you lived in and who controlled it that month. And children learned the borders the way suburban children learned bus routes. The overwhelming majority of the people inside the towers belonged to no gang and fired at no one. They were hostages of the address, paying rent to a landlord who had stopped repairing the elevators. In buildings, the police had stopped walking. The city knew all of it. The city had known for years. Among the few who kept coming anyway were a handful of police officers who volunteered to walk the grounds on foot, believing that presence might hold the place together. Then one July evening, the city's relationship with Cabrini-Green broke, publicly and permanently. On the 17th of July, 1970, two Chicago police officers, Sergeant James Severin and Officer Anthony Rizzato, were walking across the ball field at Seward Park in the middle of the complex. They were not answering a call. They belonged to a volunteer detail that walked Cabrini on foot, trying, in the language of the moment, to build trust. Sniper fire from the upper floors of the towers killed them both on the grass. Two men were convicted. The murders did to police presence at Cabrini what no policy memo ever could. Routine foot patrol effectively ended. In the years that followed, officers answered calls to the towers in groups or slowly or not at all. And the vacuum that had swallowed the ground floor economy swallowed public order too. The towers now belonged floor by floor to whoever claimed them. And the people who actually lived there, the mothers and the grandmothers and the children who made up the overwhelming majority, learned to live in a war zone administered by a landlord who had stopped showing up. It took 11 more years for the city to admit what everyone at Cabrini already knew, and when the admission came, it came as theater. In the first 3 months of 1981, gang wars at Cabrini-Green killed 11 people and wounded dozens more. The violence made the national news, and the mayor of Chicago, Jane Byrne, responded with the strangest gesture in the history of American housing policy. She moved in. In March of 1981, Byrne and her husband took a fourth-floor apartment at 1160 North Sedgwick, and the most powerful politician in Chicago became, for publicity purposes, a resident of its most dangerous address. The performance was exactly that. The apartment had been renovated ahead of her arrival. Police saturated the surrounding blocks, bodyguards held the corridor, and the shooting stopped in the way weather stops, temporarily and for reasons unrelated to anyone's speeches. Byrne stayed about 3 weeks and moved back to her lakefront apartment. The cameras left with her. The police presence thinned, the shooting resumed, and the city went back to waiting for something it could not look away from. For the next decade, the towers stayed in the national imagination as a warning, while inside them the elevators still did not work. What finally forced the city's hand was not an adult's death. Chicago had absorbed hundreds of those. It was the death of a 7-year-old boy walking to school. His name was Dantrell Davis. He lived at 502 West Oak Street, and on the morning of October 13, 1992, he left the building holding his mother's hand to walk the short distance to Jenner Elementary School. Annette Freeman was holding her son's hand when a rifle round, fired by a gang sniper from a vacant upper-floor apartment in a tower across the street, struck the boy in the head. He died almost instantly. He was the third child from that one school shot dead that year. That was the morning of October 13th. The shooter, a man named Anthony Garrett, was firing at rival gang members and hit a first grader. He was convicted and sentenced to 100 years. The city convulsed. It was one death among the thousands Cabrini had seen. But the arithmetic of it, a 7-year-old, his mother's hand, a rifle, a school run, defeated every mechanism people used to look away. The housing authority swept the towers for weapons, sealed the worst buildings, including the one the fatal shot came from, and the mayor, Richard M. Daley, began saying in public what planners had been saying in private for years. The high-rises could not be fixed. The high-rises had to come down. Before the wrecking balls, there was one last attempt to hold the towers by force. The Housing Authority's chairman in those years, Vincent Lane, had already been running armed sweeps through CHA buildings, teams moving floor to floor searching apartments for guns and squatters, sealing vacant units, installing metal detectors and guard desks in the lobbies. After Dantrell Davis died, the sweeps intensified into something close to occupation. Civil liberties lawyers sued, correctly noting that the government was searching thousands of homes without warrants, and the courts agreed. The security regime slackened, the guns came back, and the episode hardened a conclusion that had been forming in official Chicago for years. If the towers could not be governed constitutionally, they would not be governed at all. They would be removed. It is worth noticing what was never seriously funded as an alternative. Working elevators. Adequate maintenance. The steady, unglamorous landlording that Elizabeth Wood had considered the whole job. The buildings were declared ungovernable by the same institutions that had spent 40 years declining to govern them. Removal now needed only one more argument, and the buildings, left as they were, would supply it. The city's patience for the towers ended in the 1990s, and two children marked its ending. The first was Dantrell Davis. The second had no public name at all. In January of 1997, a 9-year-old girl was attacked in a stairwell of a Cabrini high-rise on North Larrabee, raped, poisoned, and left for dead. She survived, blinded and paralyzed, and because she was a minor, the press called her Girl X, a name that made her every child in the buildings at once. The man responsible was eventually convicted. By then, the case had done to the last defenders of the towers what the Davis shooting had done to the first. Between the two children, arguing for the high-rise's preservation had become politically impossible, even though the same year's record showed the obvious alternative reading, that a sealed, half-vacant tower with dead elevators and no working lights is not an argument against public housing. It is an argument against what had been done to it. And here is where this story stops being like Pruitt-Igoe, because what happened next at Cabrini was not abandonment, it was acquisition. Remember where these towers stood, not in a hollowed-out ghetto ringed by more ghetto, but a few blocks from the Gold Coast, walking distance from Lincoln Park, a mile from the most expensive shopping street in the Midwest, on the doorstep of a downtown that was booming through the 1990s. Developers had been staring at those 70 acres for decades the way a chess player stares at an undefended queen. As long as 15,000 poor tenants lived there, the land was worth little. Empty, it was worth a fortune. And by then, Cabrini-Green had acquired a second life, the one that lived on screens. A television comedy called Good Times, which premiered in 1974, followed a loving black family through hard times in a Chicago high-rise project, and its opening credits rolled over footage of Cabrini's towers. The show was warm, and its warmth carried the buildings into every living room in America as the national shorthand for the projects. What the sitcom began, a horror film finished. In 1992, a movie called Candyman gave American cinema one of its most famous monsters and set him in Cabrini-Green, filming in the actual towers, building its horror out of the caged galleries and the graffiti and the true detail of medicine cabinets that opened through the wall into the next apartment. By the early 1990s, tens of millions of Americans who had never seen Chicago could picture Cabrini-Green. It was the most famous public housing in the world, famous specifically as a place where no one should ever have to live. That fame would matter. Infamy, it turns out, is useful to demolition. In 1994, Chicago won one of the first grants from a new federal program called Hope 6, created to tear down distressed public housing and replace it with something new. The word the program and the city used for what would replace the towers was mixed income community. And in 1999, the Daley administration announced the Plan for Transformation, a $1.5 billion program to demolish every family high-rise the Chicago Housing Authority owned. 18,000 apartments across the city, the largest demolition of public housing in American history. Transformation. Stripped of the planning language, the plan was to remove the towers and most of the people in them, rebuild the land as market-rate neighborhoods with a fraction of subsidized units mixed in, and let one of the great land plays in Chicago history proceed under the flag of reform. At Cabrini-Green, the first tower had already come down in 1995. Over the next 16 years, the wrecking crews worked through the reds and the whites, and on March 30th, 2011, the last high-rise, 1230 North Burling, was taken down with the news helicopters circling. Former residents gathered on the sidewalk to watch. Some wept, some cheered. Both were right. Here is how the machine of transformation actually worked, because the mechanism is the point. The housing authority owned land it could not afford to maintain, but could legally clear. Federal Hope 6 money paid for demolition and relocation. The cleared land, some of it sold or leased to private developers at attractive terms, some kept in the deal, was rebuilt with a blend of financing, market rate units to generate profit, tax credit units for moderate incomes, and a minority share of public housing units mixed invisibly among them. The developer profited from the location. The city recovered a tax base and shed a symbol of failure. The housing authority shed buildings it had failed to run. Every institution at the table gained. The only party whose gain depended entirely on promises was the tenant holding a relocation voucher and a piece of paper describing a right to return to a neighborhood that did not yet exist. And the promise is where the whole story lands. When the plan was negotiated, tenants in good standing were guaranteed a right to return to the rebuilt neighborhood. "Take the relocation voucher," the housing authority said. "Let us knock the tower down, and when the new mixed-income community rises on this ground, you can come home." Here is what the promise was worth. Cabrini-Green held about 3,600 apartments. Investigators who traced the outcome found that the residents of only about 2,800 were ever ruled eligible to return. Hundreds of families were disqualified along the way, for lease violations, for background checks, for paperwork. 348 of them formally evicted from the process. 169 tenants died waiting on the list. And by the middle of 2020, nearly 3 decades after Dantrell Davis died and the demolitions began, the number of former Cabrini families who had actually exercised the right of return and moved into the new neighborhood stood at 1,065. Out of a community of 15,000 people, the rest are scattered across the south and west sides and the suburbs, holding vouchers in neighborhoods often poorer and no safer than the one they left, while the ground their towers stood on filled with townhomes selling for $500,000 and up. No official ever called it a removal. The plan was named transformation, and the land at least was transformed. Picture what the scattering meant for one household, a composite drawn from the record. Quick note before we carry on. I put together a field guide to 24 of these places, where they are, what happened to them, and whether you can still get in. Coordinates for every site and an honest note on the ones that are already gone. Scan the QR code on the right or the links in the description if you want it. Now back to it. A woman who raised 3 children at 502 West Oak, whose own mother had come to Cabrini from the south side in the 1950s, packs 2 generations of a family's life and accepts a voucher for a block in Inglewood where she knows no one. The scattering happened to tens of thousands of CHA families citywide, and the researchers who followed them found outcomes quieter than either side of the demolition argument likes to admit. Families with vouchers mostly landed in poor, segregated neighborhoods on the south and west sides, trading vertical poverty for horizontal poverty, a bus ride from the old one. Some found safer streets and better schools and never looked back. Others lost the dense web of kin and neighbors that had made survival at Cabrini possible. Grandmothers downstairs, cousins across the breezeway, and found themselves isolated in strange blocks where nobody owed them anything. What almost none of them found was the rebuilt near North Side. The new neighborhood's arithmetic had no room for 15,000 returners, and the screening rules saw to the rest. The community was not transformed. It was dissolved. Walk the 70 acres today, and the transformation is easy to admire, which is part of what makes it hard to see. The development that replaced the extension site is called Parkside of Old Town. $250 million of tidy mixed-income blocks, and the name itself performs a quiet erasure, borrowing the identity of the wealthy historic district to the east so that the word Cabrini appears nowhere on the signage. There is the Target at Division and Larrabee, standing roughly where towers stood, and residents both old and new shop in it. There are new schools, a new park, a police station, and cranes still working, because the Housing Authority's latest master plan calls for roughly 4,000 more units on the parcels that remain vacant, on land now so valuable that every acre is fought over in community meetings between people who want market housing, people who want affordable housing, and the dwindling group who remember what stood there. New residents pushing strollers past the Sedgwick corner mostly do not know that a mayor of Chicago once barricaded herself in a 4th-floor apartment there to prove a point about a city's shame. There is no marker to tell them. Nothing on the ball field at Seward Park names 2 officers who died on the grass. Nothing at Oak and Cleveland recalls Death Corner, or the Sicilian neighborhood, or the boy who died on Oak Street holding his mother's hand. Cabrini-Green produced mayors' careers, films, television shows, academic careers, and a folk demon. And on the ground that held it, the city built the one memorial it apparently could not do without: a shopping center. But go 1 block into the middle of it all, to the low brick rows between Oak and Chicago Avenue, and the story is still standing. The Frances Cabrini Rowhouses. The original 1942 development, the model that worked, the last piece never demolished. For years, most of the rows have stood behind chain link, windows boarded, while a shrinking cluster of families holds on in the occupied section. The last public housing tenants on the near north side, living in the middle of a construction boom that flows around their fences like water around a stone. The Housing Authority has promised rehabilitation for decades, Plans are announced, revised, announced again, while the land under the little brick rows appreciates year by year toward the day when the numbers argue, politely and in the language of transformation, for one more clearance. The people who study these things sometimes call the row houses the most valuable public housing site in America. Everyone at every community meeting understands exactly what that means. The math that cleared Little Sicily and then cleared Cabrini-Green has begun to right itself again. Cabrini-Green never recovered because recovery was never the plan that had money behind it. That is the answer to the question this video began with, and it is not complicated, just unwelcome. Repairing the towers, restoring the maintenance, rescreening the tenancies, rebuilding the police relationship. All of that was possible on paper, and none of it ever attracted $1 billion. Demolition did. The neighborhood's poverty was treated as incurable for exactly as long as its land was unwanted, and the moment the land was wanted, the incurable became urgent. The row houses are still there, behind their fences, model housing from a year when the city believed poor families deserved it. The ball field is still there at Seward Park, regraded and green. The corner at Oak Street is still there, with new brick and no plaque. And the ground itself is still there, doing what that ground has always done, waiting patiently for whoever the city decides it is for, having already outlasted Little Hell, Little Sicily, and the 15,000 people of Cabrini-Green, the neighborhood that was too poor to save, on land too valuable to leave alone. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button in the middle to watch more forgotten places and abandoned history from across America. Then click the video on the left to watch similar stories like this. Or if you really want to get stuck in, click the playlist on the right. New videos every week. I'll see you in the next one.